Prime Minister has announced a number of fundamental changes to our net zero deadlines. He has delayed the ban on all new petrol and diesel cars from 2030 to 2035. He's also delayed the ban on new boilers to 2035 too. He has scrapped the enforcement of all rental properties to have an energy performance rating of C by 2028. Some of these policies would have cost consumers as much as £20,000, depending on the type of home they live in. And I think these changes could win the Conservatives the next election. When I was, albeit briefly, Business and Energy Secretary, I said environmentalism must never be allowed to make people poor. It's important that we not outpace public support. All government has to be by consent, and people don't consent to be made cold and poor. And net zero will be achieved by innovation, not by government fiat. And until this afternoon, we were going to ban new oil boilers in 2026, which would hit people in my constituency, a rural constituency in Somerset, particularly hard, because heat pumps cost over £15,000, much more than a new oil boiler. In other words, the green consensus was going to make us, the nation, cold and poor. It's also true for the ban on new petrol and diesel cars in 2030. We talked about this before. The cheapest new electric car on the market is about £20,000. But because of the battery life, there's not much of a second-hand market in electric cars. So the cheap cars that people would buy for a few £100s when they first learned to drive were never realistically going to be available. Not surprisingly, a number of electric car company bosses have admitted that there are no plans for mass market products because production costs are simply too high. Additionally, we were set to destroy the private rental market with punitive measures for landlords. It's going to make it more costly for landlords, but landlords pass these costs on to tenants, or they simply leave the market, removing choice. That's why the Prime Minister's announcements are so encouraging. He's putting the interests of consumers, of the British people first. Because if green energy was so cheap, as its proponents maintain, it would already be taking over from fossil fuels by market forces. Instead, its high cost was impoverishing our society. The same is true in other places too. Look at Germany, which spent more on green energy than anyone else, and yet they pay more per kilowatt hour than any other country in the world. Similarly in Denmark, and it's what we were doing here. It may be, with new technology, green energy will become cheap, but it won't become cheap just because the government says so. The whole point of government, the whole point of politics, of public service, is to make people's lives easier and help them to become more prosperous. The rush to net zero was making people poor. Rishi Sunak's also got rid of the fanaticism on recycling, where people were going to have 7 bins. Again, politics is about making people's lives easier to lead, not more bureaucratic and complex. And to achieve net zero, there must be popular support. This will not be maintained if people are penalised, so a measured introduction is essential. Rishi Sunak has sent the hair shirt to the incinerator. He's lifted the burden off society, and actually he will make net zero by 2050 more rather than less likely.